The Baroque period begins in the 1600 and it goes all the way to 1750. Basically what we're talking about here is the beginnings of opera in Italy all the way to the death of Johann Sebastian Bach. Most people, when they think of Baroque, they think complex. Well, look at this picture over here. Look at everything that's going on in this picture. It was often thought that Baroque music was overly decorated. But it didn't start out that way. In fact, it started out very, very simple. But the important word to understand is counterpoint. Composers have an irresistible attraction to counterpoint. That is, piling notes on top of each other in a vertical organization. The Baroque period may have started out with a zero counterpoint, but by the end, it was some of the most densely contrapuntal music there is. So where did the Baroque period really get started? In the city of Venice. That was one of the main places. Italy was very, very important to the Baroque, but none more important than Venice. In 1633, the Teatro di San Cassiano opened. That was the first opera house. And opera was all the rage in the city of Venice and all throughout northern Italy especially. Everybody could go to the opera for half a scudo, which may not have been no money, but it wasn't a whole lot of money. And what were they interested in? They were interested in star singers. They were interested in complex stage machinery that would do things like flood the stage and have sea battles and all kinds of stuff. It was almost like going to a modern Broadway show for the average person in Venice in 1600. So who was the great composer of the operas? Well, there were a lot of them, but none greater than Claudio Monteverdi. Lots of composers, but none like Monteverdi. By the time he moved to Venice in around 1600, he already had a distinguished career behind him. He had patrons in other northern Italian cities who had commissioned works by him and had made his life sometimes miserable because they refused to pay him. Well, when he moved to Venice, he had it made, finally, in his mature years. And he spent the last 35 years of his life working at a church and making operas. When we get to the middle part of the Baroque, okay, now we're talking about 1650 to 1700, there starts to be an interest in instrumental music. And who was the great instrumental maker? Here's where we start to get an interest in actual instruments themselves. Well, this fellow right here is Antonio Stradivarius, and he lived in the city of Cremona. And when he made his wonderful violins, many of you may have heard of Stradivarius violins before, but when he made his violins, composers were quick to pick up on the potentials to those instruments. So instrumental music started to become really important. There were two types of instrumental sonatas, as they called them. Sonatas are basically multi-movement instrumental works for usually 4 instruments. 3 or 4 instruments, sometimes even more. Anyway, there were 2 types. There was a type that was a series of dances that was called a chamber sonata, and then there was a type that was called a church sonata. Here's a church. Okay, that's the Cremona Cathedral that we're looking at right there. And in a church like that, you would hear music by the great composers of the Middle Baroque period. And these composers were writing serious pieces for the churches and chamber pieces that were a lot lighter. So a serious piece for the church would have been a piece that contained a type of instrumental work called a fugue. Fugue comes from the Italian word meaning to fly. Actually, what it means is an intricate piece of contrapuntal music. There's that word again, counterpoint, contrapuntal music. So even though in 50 years, even though composers had lost interest in counterpoint at the beginning of 1600, by the mid of the 17th century, these composers were starting to feel the irresistible pull to counterpoint, and counterpoint was considered to be serious. That's why you would be composing it for a church. One of the most important composers of the Middle Baroque was a man by the name of Arcangelo Corelli. He wrote lots and lots of church sonatas. They had fugues in them. Fugues were contrapuntal. Okay, so it wasn't just all about Italy, the Baroque period. Of course it wasn't. Where else did Baroque music get written? France, over here, Louis XIV, and also Austria, Leopold I. Not a very good looking guy, is he? Kind of really weird looking lips and an outrageous mustache. Forget about his hair and his pantaloons. Anyway, this guy over here, Louis XIV, was as important to the Baroque in France as anyone. Probably the most important. He was the great monarch of France. If you've ever been to Paris, anytime you look around and you see some of the great Baroque architecture, it's because of this guy, Louis XIV, Louis XIV. That's why you're seeing it, because he was incredibly ostentatious, he was incredibly rich, and he was incredibly able to make all of Europe be envious of him because he did everything with a lot of style. Most importantly, he was a dancer. And if you wanted to be anything in the court of Louis XIV, you better know how to dance, because that was the thing that separated the people who were in and the people who were out. And Louis XIV also was the king who made it possible for Italian composers to move up to France and then start to write opera in French. The most famous of the Baroque opera composers in France was named Lully, Lully, and actually he was an Italian named Lully who had moved up to teach Louis XIV how to dance, gained great favor at the court, became the court composer, and basically started the Baroque movement in France by writing operas. The Habsburgs, who would come after Leopold I, were actually very great patrons of the arts, and when we get to the 18th century and we start to talk about Mozart, the Habsburgs are going to be completely indispensable. Let's remember, everybody, there's no art music, there's no concert music without rich patrons. It's kind of always been that way, and it's sort of that way today too.